In this video, I'm going to talk about why the Sony 20mm F1.8 ultra-wide full-frame Sony mirrorless lens is worth $900. A special thanks goes out to Sony for sending me this lens to borrow for 2 weeks. Unfortunately, I have to send it back in a couple of days, and that is a little bit sad because this is a very good lens if you have a full-frame Sony mirrorless camera. Now, if you have an APS-C camera, I'm going to review this lens on an APS-C camera, but I would not recommend spending $900 to get yourself one of these. The equivalent lens on APS-C would be roughly a 13.5mm f1.8 ultra-wide, which would be amazing if Sony ever came out with something like that. Even if they went wider at like 12 or 10, that would be one of my ultimate dream lenses from Sony. So if you're listening, please make it happen, Sony. Let's start by taking a closer look at this lens and what makes it so special. Now, the F1.8 20G is simply a G lens. It's not a G master like the 24 1.4, but it is every bit as good as any G master lens that I've tried. Weighing in at 392 grams, this lens is very lightweight. It's compact. It's a little bit smaller than the Sigma 16mm for APS-C, just for reference. It is weather sealed, featuring a small rubber gasket around the mount, which means it is dust and moisture resistant. It comes with a removable plastic lens hood. It features a 67mm filter thread and minimum focusing distance of 0.63 of a foot, or right about 7 inches. The overall build is very good. It's made out of plastic and metal, but it feels very premium. The focusing ring is towards the front of the lens, very smooth. It's all electronic, not mechanical. There's some nice branding on the top of the lens, nice G logo towards the side. It features a focus hold button, which is great for portraiture, even though this isn't really a portrait lens, an autofocus to manual focus switch, as well as a switch to turn the click on and off on the aperture ring. This is great for video work because you can simply de-click the aperture ring, and now you have a very smooth, very quiet, unlimited variable variant aperture control. And the fact that this lens has an aperture ring is really nice because it's much faster to twist the aperture ring than it is to go through the camera settings and adjust your aperture. Towards the back of the lens, you have a full frame cutout. As you would expect, you have electronic connections because this lens does support autofocus. And speaking of autofocus, you have Sony's newest dual XD linear motors, which is what they feature in their high-end lenses in this compact little lens, which means silent, fast, and accurate autofocus out of this lens. This lens features 14 elements in 12 groups and a 9-blade aperture. Very smooth, creamy bokeh as a result. Now, one of the interesting things that I found with this lens is once I picked it up, as you move the lens forward and back, the inside element actually moves, and it almost feels like the lens is broken. Obviously, as you put it on the camera and start it up, it clicks into place and there's no longer that movement. But it is something worthy of note. Although this is a full-frame lens, you can use it on an APS-C sensor Sony mirrorless camera, such as the a6100 that I have right here. And you get a package that is still very compact and lightweight. Let's take a look at some sample photos using this lens on my a6100 handheld. These are all JPEGs, no post-processing, no editing of any kind. Here we go. So it's clear that this lens is very sharp and a very good performer even on an APS-C censored camera. The results that I got from this lens are quite amazing and up there next to Sigma primes in my opinion. 20mm is a great focal length on an APS-C size sensor. It's equivalent to 30mm on a full frame, so you get a little bit of street photography, a little bit of wider landscapes. You can do some wider portraits if you like, and the fact that this lens is f1.8 means that you get some decent nice bokeh, very creamy, even though this is a wider lens. But all that being said, I would still not recommend buying this lens if you only have a Sony APS-C mirrorless camera, because I think $900 is pushing it for essentially a semi-wide angle prime lens. And you can get away with a $350 Sigma 16 that's going to be similar in size. Yes, it's a little bit wider, but it's also a little bit faster as well. And in terms of sharpness, it is very close. More about that later. So let's discuss the merits of this lens if you have a full frame Sony mirrorless, such as the A7 III that I have behind me. This combo makes a whole lot more sense, and it performs very well as you might expect. In fact, here are some more sample photos, this time using the Sony A7 III handheld, no editing, no post-processing, and this Sony 20mm f1.8. Here we go. Alright, so I have to admit I really do like this lens, especially after using it on a full-frame Sony mirrorless camera, because I get it now. It makes sense. Now, I did something kind of interesting. I compared the sharpness of the 20mm on an A7 III to the Sigma 16mm on my A6100. I thought this would be an interesting comparison. Now, the focal lengths aren't equivalent. The 16mm on the A6100 is more equivalent to a 24mm on a full frame, so the 20mm is a little bit wider, but nonetheless, here are the results. As you can see, as I punch into my wife's face here, there is very little difference between the two lenses. If I was forced to decide, I would say the Sony 20mm is just a touch sharper than the Sigma 16 on a crop sensor camera, and that is very impressive. The reason this lens is so impressive is because, in my opinion, some of Sony's prime lens releases, specifically on the APS-C lineup, I'm thinking about the Sony 20mm f2.8, the Sony 16mm f2.8 of old, have been, well, pretty terrible. This lens, however, is very, very sharp, and the fact that it keeps up and surpasses the sharpness of a Sigma 16mm says a lot about its performance. And I found that it was very sharp even wide open at f1.8. It was very sharp in the corners, and no matter which camera I put this lens on, full frame or APS-C, it produced excellent results. So this lens is sharp wide open, but beyond just being sharp, it also has very little to no distortion that I've seen. Now, chromatic aberration is almost non-existent, and you saw a little bit of that in this side-by-side. Even compared to the Sigma 16, which in my opinion is very good at controlling chromatic aberration, the Sony 20mm knocks it out of the park. There's very little to no chromatic aberration with this lens. Wide open, there is some vignetting in the corners and they do pull a little bit, but I'm talking very minute. Even if you don't have the corrections turned on with your camera, you're not really gonna notice it. The 20mm focal length on a full frame sensor produces an ultra wide field of view, which is great for landscapes. It's great for nighttime photography. In fact, here are some examples if you are into shooting astrophotography. And with a minimum focusing distance of just about 7 inches, you can get nice and close to your subject and still have a little bit of a bokeh background. So $900, let's recap why I think this lens is worth it if you have a full frame Sony mirrorless camera. Number one, it's compact, very small for an ultra wide angle lens. Number two, it's lightweight. Number three, it's built very well. Number four, it gives you an ultra wide angle field of view, which is great. It's also fast at f1.8, so you can use it for a whole lot of situations, a very usable lens. Number five, it has those linear motors that are silent, great at autofocus, very accurate, very fast. Number six, this lens is weather sealed. Number seven, it has an aperture ring, which you can use clicked or declicked. Number eight, it has very sharp optics. That means it's very sharp, even wide open at f1.8, which you can't say about very many lenses. Number nine, distortions such as chromatic aberration and vignetting are almost non-existent or very well controlled. Barrel distortion is really not an issue with this lens straight out of the camera. And also flare is very well controlled with the elements and the coatings that they've used on these lenses. There are a whole lot of things to like about this lens, and that's why I think this is probably one of the best lenses that you can buy for a full frame Sony mirrorless camera, and that's saying a lot. Now, there are two things that I noticed that were kind of shortcomings, things I didn't like. Number one is the aperture ring itself. The clicks themselves feel a little bit plasticky. It's also, in my opinion, a little bit too easy to rotate the aperture ring. So if you are just kind of using the lens casually, it's easy to bump it on accident, but I feel like the actual click mechanism should be a little bit more refined than it is and more clicky. The second thing, and this is kind of nitpicky, is it does have quite a bit of focus breathing. If you're using this lens for video and you're either manually racking focus or you are using autofocus, you'll notice that the picture kind of moves in and out as the lens focuses. So it is something to be aware of. Man, I wish Sony would create something like this lens for APS-C. Like I said, if they would come out with a 13mm f1.8 or a 12mm f1.8 prime lens for APS-C, it would be a dream come true. If you guys are interested in reading more specs about this lens, as usual, I'll post a link down below. If you have any questions, you can comment down below also. I'll do my best to respond to those. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for all of your likes, comments, and support. Stay tuned for more and have a great day. Bye-bye.